So if you're tuning into us on Facebook, we've got a little bit of a different setup tonight, mainly because one of the cords got left at home. I was testing out the audio a minute ago, but it sounded fine, so we're going to proceed from here, and then hopefully we'll have all that settled by next Wednesday. So we are picking up in our study in 1 Samuel chapter 10, and when we started off last week, we talked essentially about how the events of chapter 9 are sort of it's sort of confined between Samuel, Saul, and his servant, and in a sense, Samuel is being told that he will be the king. Saul is being told that he will be the king. It's sort of a private affair that we talked about at the end of chapter 9 because the servant's gone on. Chapter 10, we talked about how Samuel's actually anointed as king with the oil. Again, that was not just done to kings. Sometimes it was done to high priest. Again, it just showed a dedication to God. And then we talked about how that, on top of all of this, Samuel reinforces the fact that Saul will be king based on a series of events that happens in verses 2 through 6. Saul will encounter 3 different groups of people, and they're all going to do different things. And as we know what was the case with Samuel, all of those things came to pass based on verses 9 and 10. Now at some point, Saul is going to go down to Gilgal and meet with Samuel once again. Again, I believe what's stated, 7 days shalt thou tarry till I come to thee. So they meet once again. Saul, as he's returning home, it says that his heart's changed, or that his it seems like his mindset is set on being the king. His uncle, of course, his uncle comes to him, tries to figure out where Saul has been, and Saul just simply says that he went out to find the donkeys. He doesn't talk about what Samuel has said about him becoming the king. And we talked about a couple of reasons why that might have been. And maybe Saul's uncle, his connection with maybe the inheritance that Saul would not have received if he had died. That might have gone to the uncle. Whatever the case may be, verses, really 1 Samuel 9 through verse 16 of chapter 10 is really Saul being told he's king, but all of this is in a way a private affair. What happens tonight, beginning in verse 17, is the people of Israel are going to know for sure that Saul is king. The announcement of him being king is going to become a public affair. It's going to become public knowledge. And beginning in verse 17, we might entitle this section that Saul is pronounced as king at Mizpah. So verse 17, let's look at verses 17 and 18. It says that Samuel called the people together unto the Lord to Mizpah, and said unto the children of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up, Israel, out of Egypt, and delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all kingdoms, and of them that oppressed you. So we begin by keeping in mind what happened at the end of chapter 8. Because at the end of chapter 8, people have told Samuel, we want a king. Samuel tells him to depart. And the implication is that their request is going to be fulfilled. In chapter 9, sort of it moved to looking at Saul and Samuel personally, but now we've returned to looking at Samuel dealing with the Israelites as a whole. The people had wanted a king. They wanted Samuel to be involved. Samuel, of course, was involved, but he is not the one that is the sole chooser of who's going to be the king. And Samuel's essentially just gathered the people together in verse 17 to tell them essentially that the time is at hand. The matter of wanting a king, it's come to pass. The king has been selected. And is going to be demonstrated in the verses that follow. The word called or shout is more than just the idea of speaking something, but also carries the idea of summoning people. The idea of summoning, to call together, you're calling assembly together. And so now in chapter 9 we have the public selection as king. Of course, Saul had to wait a period of time. As we talked about it, maybe it shows a little bit about the patience of Saul in this. Whatever the case may be, the time is now for the public to know that Saul has been selected as king. This is essentially God's choice as king. That's going to be the theme. That's going to be something that carries forward here. The people wanted Samuel, but Samuel's going to emphasize that God has chosen king, not just in his words, but also he's going to demonstrate by the actions that are going to take place. Now, verse 18 sort of also almost begins out of, a reminder of what God has done for the Israelites up to this point. And we think about how it's focused on what had been done in Egypt to the Egyptians, but Samuel also emphasizes to think beyond that. Think about what has happened even recently, that through God they had been delivered from the hand of all kingdoms and of them that oppressed you. Now we know that connects really to the time period of Judges and the cycle that's over and over again. And these are people that are not far removed from what had happened in 1 Samuel chapter 7, right? Where the people repented at the words of Samuel, that God delivers them from the Philistines in that process. They're not all that far removed from them, so the people had direct knowledge. They directly saw God delivering them from the hand of their oppressors. But how often people forget some very common things, right? People essentially probably had forgotten what God had done for them up to this point. And really, verse 18 sort of begins a point of showing that, despite all that God has done for you, you have failed to appreciate what He has done. And what becomes a focus going forward in this account with Saul is really how the leadership of God is far superior than the leadership of man, especially based on the actions of what Saul does in terms of when he's going to be called to step forth to be called the king. So the leadership of man is far inferior. The leadership of God is far superior to the leadership of man. That is going to be emphasized in verses 17 through 27. So they're called together, verse 19. Samuel continues on that line of thought, right? Remember what God has done for you. Verse 19, and ye have this day rejected your God, who himself saved you out of all your adversities and your tribulations. And ye have said unto him, Nay, or no, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. So you've rejected God, and now Samuel says to present yourself before the Lord. And I believe Brother Wayne talked about this maybe in Bible class or sermon on Sunday, but how difficult, how terrifying it might be to think about presenting yourself before God, because God, of course, can see all things. It might be that when the people hear this, that they might think that a rebuke is coming from God directly because of what Samuel has just said. Maybe a rebuke is coming because it looks like we're being criticized pretty harshly here. But what's about to be demonstrated is that the people's wishes to have a king have come to pass, and that the king has been chosen by an approved method. And this is going to be demonstrated going forward, even though the king has already been selected. So present yourselves before the Lord. In other words, examine yourself and listen to what is about to take place. Witness what's about to take place. So they gathered together. Verse 20 says, and when Samuel had caused all the tribes of Israel to come near, the tribe of Benjamin was taken. Now, we don't have this written down that they casted lots, but the implication of the words here suggests that what was being done was the casting of lots. And you notice this from the phrase was taken in verse 20. It's going to be said again in verse 21 on 2 occasions. The phrase was taken. And we're going to note that that's not necessarily a literal taking or a literal grabbing of the people because of what happens in verse 21. But the idea here is that they casted lots. And the important thing about this is that this had already been a divinely approved method of determining things based on some other events in Israel's history. You don't have to go back very far. We turn in our Bibles to Joshua chapter 7, where we deal with the sin of Achan, who the people of Israel really at that point didn't know who was responsible for there defeated Ai. But in Joshua chapter 7, verses 16 through 18, you see this same phrase, was taken, again. Verse 16, so Joshua rose up early in the morning and brought Israel by their tribes, and the tribe of Judah was taken. And he brought the family of Judah, and he took the family of the Zarhites, and he brought the family of the Zarhites man by man, and Zabdi was taken. And he brought his household man by man, Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah, was taken. So in that section you see that phrase, was taken, being used over and over again. And it turns out that Achan was the one responsible, rightly chosen, and he's put to death for that. You move forward in the book of Joshua to Joshua chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. Specifically in verse 2, you also read about the usage of using lots to determine which tribe had which territory. And this was demonstrated to be divinely approved, that this is the method that God had selected. And so when this process that's beginning to be described in verse 20, if you read this on the surface, you might think that what Samuel's doing is he's going out and he's examining and looking at all these people, and then it would almost appear that Samuel's just making a decision based on what he sees. And so it might indicate, if we just read this on the surface, that Samuel's is the one that's making all of the decisions. But in reality, that's not what's happening here. The idea of casting lots, or the phrasing that's used here, is the idea that God is working and directing Samuel with who is going to be chosen as king. Now, Samuel already knows who's king, but this is for the public. And the public really has no right to reject what Samuel says, because they understood that casting of lots in this sense was how God determined some important decisions based on what we saw in the book of Joshua. So God's going to give them essentially what appeared to be a capable leader. Now you see verse 20 again, that the first group that is taken among the tribes of Israel is the tribe of Benjamin. And perhaps this shocks a lot of people. Again, Benjamin was not thought of to be a very important brother. He was the last brother that was born of the sons of Jacob. You would think that maybe the king comes from the tribe of Reuben, who's the firstborn son. You might think that the king's going to come from the tribe of Judah, which was thought of at one point to be one of the more powerful military tribes. It's not going to come from the tribe of Levi, who are the priests, and in terms of the religion of Judaism, right, the most important. Not going to come from them. It's going to come from the tribe of Benjamin, the youngest of the brothers. And likewise, verse 21, when he had caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by their families, the family of Matri was taken, and Saul the son of Kish was taken. So you're sort of working your way down. Saul, of course, noted that his family was the least of all in his tribe, so maybe the person that's not expected is selected as king. But the people are going to, for the most part, going to rejoice in who is selected as king. Now, we notice in verse 21, this is how we know that this phrase was taken is not literal in nature. Right? Because verse 21, the family of Matri was taken, and Saul the son of Kish was taken, and when they sought him, he could not be found. Right? So if this is a literal phrase here, you've got a problem, right? Because how can you take Saul, how can you grab Saul, and in the same breath say that he's not there? Right? It's literally impossible to do that. The point being is that phrase was taken, talks about casting lots. Saul didn't necessarily have to be there for that. Maybe that gives us some evidence of what that phrase meant.
Would it be better if it had been translated, had been chosen instead of taken?
Yeah, it could have been, because you can choose somebody without actually having to, without having to be within their presence. The first example of my mind that comes to mind is, sports teams. They have a draft, and they choose certain players, but the player may not be there where they're drafting him, and that's a good example. Right? The phrase was chosen. Maybe that's how some translations have it. The idea again is that God is behind this. Samuel is not doing this according to what he sees, but He's working in connection with God to show Israel who God has selected to be king. And when you think about who all is gathered here, it might be pretty easy to lose sight of someone. You've got all of verse 17, Samuel called the people together. You've got a lot of people in this area. Might have been very easy to lose someone. I'm sure Dad and Mom have told you all this story about, I believe we were in the mountains and we were at a concert, and I can't remember who it was. Yeah, it was a Lee Greenwood concert, and somehow I got lost. I believe that was me that time. I got lost in the crowd, and just because when you come out of the theater, there were a lot of people that were in the forum outside of it. Sometimes it's easy to lose somebody when they get into a crowd. A really good example of that is Disney World. How many kids every day have sort of lost their parents in Disney World because of just how many people are there. Those things can happen, but we know that Saul's not a little kid at this time. He's a fully grown man and a very tall one at that. Maybe you think to yourself, verse 21 again, that Saul's not found. Maybe you think to yourself, the people's thinking, maybe this king's doing some very noble deed at this point. Maybe he's out at work helping the people or helping someone. Maybe he's dealing with some enemies far away, and that's why we can't find him. Maybe that's your first inclination, thinking about where is the supposed king of Israel. And verse 22, you kind of have to wonder, with the people, maybe they begin to regret a little bit about wanting a king based on what Saul's doing. Verse 22, therefore they inquired of the Lord further, if the man should yet come here. And the Lord answered, behold, he hath hidden himself among the stuff. So apparently Saul would do very well in the game of hide and seek, right? Because the people can't find him at all. And it's actually God who has to step in and tell the people where Saul is hiding. Could have been that Saul directly told Samuel. We know that the high priest, part of the garment that he wore on top, contained the stones, the Urim and the Thummim, which allowed for communication with God as well. Whatever the case may be, God has communicated that Saul is hiding among the stuff. And we know that God can see anything that man tries to hide, whether that be Saul, whether that be in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve trying to hide their nakedness. God could see that, even though they try to hide. A less thought of example of this is the example of Jonah, because what Jonah was doing was, instead of going to Nineveh, he was trying to flee to Tarshish. And Tarshish was the farthest location, the farthest western location in the Mediterranean Sea, more than likely modern-day Spain. And so the idea is that Jonah was trying to get to the ends of the earth, the farthest ends that many men only knew at that point. And even then, Jonah cannot get away from God, even though he tried to flee to one of the farthest reaches of the earth at that point, at least that man knew. So God can see all things, and even though Saul tries to hide, God is able to see him and where he's at. You notice verse 22 that he has hidden himself among the stuff. And that's a very great technical word right there, isn't it? The stuff. One translation has it as the baggage or the luggage. And so what you have pictured here at Mizpah is really a large group of people that have assembled together. They're not here just for one night, but they're probably here for a few days, just for the nature of travel. So to carry all of your luggage, you had a lot of clothing and stuff with that. You got to take provisions for yourself. And maybe it was the case where it was easier for Saul to hide amongst the luggage. And that's what Saul does. With enough of it, maybe that's able to hide his stature. Whatever the case may be, God finds him. And really, this is not a great look for Saul to begin with. Right? Because the people might be thinking to themselves again that they are regretting selecting a king based on what God said in verse 18, how God over and over again had delivered them. In reality, God had not hid. Right? Verse 18, right? God delivered them from the Egyptians, delivered them from the Moabites, the Ammonites, all the people in the book of Judges and Joshua. God did not hide in any of those moments in terms of delivering them. But now here's Saul, who has been selected, as we noted in chapter 9, Saul has been selected to be the captain over the people of God. And here is the captain of Israel that's hiding from his own people. And so maybe if you're one of the Israelites there, you're thinking to yourself, you got a sick feeling in your stomach that maybe we made the wrong decision. Well, it's not a great look for Saul. And it just goes to show for us, the application we can draw for us is that we don't put our utmost faith in men. Saul's going to prove that he made mistakes, made some very serious mistakes. You remember there in the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul was dealing with an issue of Christians that essentially had stated that they tried to elevate certain men over others, whether that was Paul himself, whether that was Apollos, whether that was Peter. The church in Corinth had elevated certain men in position. In a couple of chapters later, Paul just simply stated that I'm a minister. Apollos is a minister for Christ, that we plant and water, but that it's God that gives the increase. And part of that argument that Paul's setting forth is put your trust in God, don't put your faith in elevating certain men. And this is a good example of this, right? You don't put your faith, you don't put your utmost faith in men just because like Saul here, right? He's hiding from the people. Nevertheless, Saul's actually going to prove himself to be king in chapter 11. We may get into that a little bit tonight. Verses 23 through 24, the people go and find him and they rejoice in their king. Verse 23, they ran and fetched him thence. And when he stood among the people, he was higher than any of the people from his shoulders and upward. And Samuel said to all the people, see ye him whom the Lord hath chosen, that there is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king. Again, height is a very important aspect of leadership at the time. It sort of, again, promotes intimidation of the enemy. And in a very literal sense, right, people looked up to Saul because you had to. If he's taller than all the other people around him, you had to look up to him. We think about looking up to someone in terms of respect and things like that, but the people literally had to look up to Saul. So he appears to be a great king on the surface. And now, based on what Samuel says, the Lord hath chosen him, there's no doubt that God has chosen Saul to be king. The phrase in verse 24, see ye him whom the Lord hath chosen, that there is none like him among all the people. This is not just talking about his physical stature, as it is also talking about how no one has the right to challenge Saul for the throne. Again, God has made that decision, and in the eyes of God, Samuel's reiterating the message of the Lord, right? There's no one that God's going to look at as being a rival to Saul, at least at this point. It's not like God has selected two men and these two men have to fight to be the king. God has solely selected Saul to be the king. So that's an important thing that Samuel brings out, that there is none like him among all the people. Saul has been specifically selected to be the king. And the people respond, verse 24, God save the king. And all that means is, it's sort of a way of saying good fortune, or we wish you the best. The phrase long live the king would be something similar what's being said about Saul. And so the people, at least at this point, seem like they agree on it. Verse 25, we might could say that the people's agreement, Samuel's going to get it in writing. Verses 25 and 26, Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom and wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord. Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. And Saul also went home to Gibeah, and there went with him a band of men whose hearts God had touched. So, verse 25, we might could think about this in terms of a legal document here. Samuel goes on to instruct the people about the type of kingdom, maybe a reminder of what was given in chapter 8 about how Saul would rule as a king. Apparently they agree to it, they write it down in a book, and they laid it before the Lord. So the decision is now in writing, right? The people can't go back and say that, we didn't agree to what was proposed here. They can't go back and say that because they've got it down in writing that a majority of the people, at least, as we'll see about verse 27, not all, but a majority have agreed on what was stated. So they've got it in writing. And Samuel, in a sense, is sort of acting as a witness to this degree, because Samuel, being the spokesman for God, in a way is sort of mediating between God and the people of Israel at this point. And you think about important documents, again, you don't just leave those things laying around, right? Think about the Declaration of Independence. I know a movie's been made about how someone stole it, even though that's fiction. The Declaration of Independence, that's not just lying around in a building, right? It's under security. Constitution, same way. Any important documents, your personal documents, you don't leave your Social Security card out, in an open area, right? Because you don't want people stealing your information. You don't leave your, you don't leave your birth certificate just laying out on the table. You keep that protected. Your car insurance, your proof of insurance. A lot of people keep that in connection with maybe in their car, right? You just don't leave that laying around because it's an important document. Well, this is an important document, and the idea here about laying it before the Lord, in part, just shows that Samuel's putting this in a secure place, right? He's not just going to lay this on his kitchen table. He's not just going to lay it, in a building in the city of Mizpah, because this is a serious document. It needs to be protected, and it needs to be protected so that the people remember that they have agreed to this, and they've got it in writing. You keep in mind Exodus chapter 25, verses 16 and 21. There, Moses is being told that the Ten Commandments, right, the covenant, the testimony is what's said there, was kept in the Ark of the Covenant, right? So the Ten Commandments is an important document, and that was kept before the Lord, just like this agreement is as well. So verse 26, verse 25, the people agree. Essentially, they go to their home, very similar to the end of chapter 8. A little bit different based on verse 27. You note in verse 26 that Saul is going to return home with more men. Saul also went home to Gibeah, and there went with him a band of men whose hearts God had touched. Now, you might think this is a little bit odd for Saul to return home because he has just been elected. The people have agreed that he's going to be the king of Israel. So why is the king, Saul, going to go back and live in the home of, at this point, a commoner compared to his status of being king? As we'll see in chapter 11, Saul's actually going to go home, and he's actually going to be performing some tasks that you wouldn't think a king would. And what's going to happen in chapter 11 is that Saul essentially will prove himself to be king. And one of the things that it shows to us, well, we'll mention that in a moment. But you know that, again, Saul's not going home empty-handed. There's a band of men whose hearts God had touched. Again, this is not carrying the idea that these men didn't have any free will. Some might assume that based on the idea of God touching their hearts. The idea is just that these men felt compelled to join Saul. These are probably going to be military men, military advisors, and they've recognized that God has appointed Saul as king, and maybe they feel an obligation that, if this is God's king, we need to be there to support him, and these are men that are going to be loyal to Saul. And so now they feel inclined to be with Saul. And this is a really good example. Let's read 27 first. But the children of Belial said, "How shall this man save us?" And they despised him and brought him no presents, but he held his peace. Now the author writes that not everybody here is in agreement. Right? God, through inspiration, reveals that not everybody agreed to this decision. And these people are labeled as the sons of Belial. And, well, I'll ask you, do you remember what the word Belial means? Yeah, the idea again here, the children of Belial, these are worthless children, or these are meaningless people. And again, the idea that's used oftentimes with the idea of worthless in this context and in this sense is that these are people that are working against the plan of God. And that's very clear here. These people have rejected God, God's anointed as king. They're obviously working against Him by rejecting, again, God's anointed king. Now, you might think that these men are justified in this, right? They ask themselves a question. They ask the rhetorical question, how shall this man save us? And based on what you saw with Saul hiding himself among the luggage of the camp at Mizpah, it might be reasonable to ask this question, how in the world is this man going to save us when he's terrified of his own people? He doesn't even want to come out amongst us. We had to go fetch him. You might think that that's reasonable. Maybe these are people that just like the old way better in terms of the period of the judges. Again, we might think that they might be justified in this because, God had put in place the old system, right? The problem was with us and not with the system. But the point being here is that God has implemented a new system, right? You think about that in context with the Old and New Testament. A lot of people, some Christians, again, in the first century, we see in Hebrews, Galatians, and several Paul's letters, they struggle with not reverting back to Judaism, right? And there were, of course, Judaism had at one point been God's system for how man should be obedient to Him. But the point being for those that were trying to revert back to Judaism was that God has implemented a new system through His Son Christ, and that if you want salvation, you've got to obey by the system that God has put in place. These men are worthless men because even though they might have had faith in the old system, God has instituted a new system, and they've got to put their trust in it. You see in verse 27, they despised him. They looked down. They might have envied him, and they brought him no presents. Generally, you would expect to bring presents to the king as a sign of your loyalty. But you know that Saul, in verse 27, that he held his peace. And what comes of this is that Saul's going to be the type of person that's going to let his actions doing the talk, let his actions do all the talking, rather than responding to these men. And sometimes that is the best way to handle insults. Sometimes we are unfairly criticized, we are, unfairly insulted, whatever the case may be. It's not necessarily wrong to defend your reputation by words, but it's another thing to actually live a life that goes against those insults that are being thrown at you. Well, Saul's going to let his actions do the talking based on chapter 11, and he's essentially going to prove that these worthless men, their accusation against him is completely unfounded. But first, he's got to prove himself, which is the main subject of chapter 11. Now, in chapter 11, I sort of think about this. I think about it in the context of verse 27. I often think about this as probably Saul's proudest moment in his life. Not just because of his defeat of the Ammonites, but also how he handles the aftermath of it. You see Saul, maybe his patience in chapter 10, the fact that he doesn't get so upset with the people that are insulting him in verse 27, and then how he really handles victory and handles it well in chapter 11. It's one of Saul's proudest moments, one of his few prouder moments in terms of his kingship. We'll just go ahead and mention that a little bit for a moment tonight, and we'll talk more about this next week because this does begin a new section. But again, Samuel's going to be present here as well. Samuel's always going to continue to have an active role with both Saul and David up to his death. So Samuel's still going to be an important figure. One of the things that we'll see at the end of chapter 11 is that the kingship of Saul will be renewed because of what happens here. And 1 Samuel chapter 11 sort of resembles the book of Judges a lot because the person that became judge was one who delivered the Israelites from oppression. In the same light as we'll see in chapter 11, the people will look to Saul, and Saul will begin to get the respect of a king because Saul's going to deliver the Israelites from oppression. And so there's there's sort of a similar story that takes place in chapter 11 with some of the instances in the book of Judges. And so, as is the case there in terms of leadership here in the Old Testament, a lot of times military victory sort of showed the people that they could handle the job, that those leaders could handle the job. That's going to be true with the example of Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 11. I know we're a little bit early, but we're going to go ahead and stop here tonight since this is the end of this major section. But thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this evening.